As retailers entered the lockdown in March 2020, a small, diverse group of Canadian thought leaders gathered to virtually speculate, collaborate, and share their insights on the waves of disruption facing retailers. The Business of Retail podcast emerged as an unflinching strategic alternative to the conventional discourse, revealing challenges in the headlines and exploring new, unconventional paths for all facets of the retail industry. Now, here's the panel.
Hi, everybody. This is the Business of Retail series. I'm joined here today by David Ian Gray, George Minikakis, Gary Newbury, and myself, Christine Cowan. And we've got a really great topic today. We're going to talk about boards and what boards might be expecting from their executives as we look into 2021 and beyond. So hot topic, and I think George, being our resident board expert, I'm going to toss it over to you.
Okay, great. So here's the only question you have to ask is, how are you going to turn business around? That would be the first one that comes out of everybody's mouth, and because it's on their minds. But the real current, the CEO at that point would have to say, look, I'm going to paint a picture for you. And it's a business crisis within a health crisis. And we have two competing situations. We can try to address all the business issues, but the health crisis is so fluid that we don't know how each strategy we take is going to affect or effectively work or not work. So you have to work with what's the current state. David, Gary was talking about, the financial side of this. So the financial question is, so what do we need to do, or what do we think we can do in 2021? Do we go back? Do we capture what we did in 2019? Are we close to that? Or how much of a gap is there? How much of a gap is there between 2020 results and 2019 to get to achieve our 2021 objective? I don't think, and there's anybody out there, they're probably saying, we're going to achieve our 2019 targets or sales in 2021. I hope not, because that would be too idealistic. But the first challenge that the board is going to be looking at is what's the current state of events, and that's financial and how they're going to get to achieve it. The second one is going to be, over the next 2 years, what's the state of the crisis, right? What are we being told by experts? How long could this last? And what are the challenges for us going forward? And then the third level will be, what's the future state? What happens to the industry, right? How does that change? How prepared are we to be a part of that? What resources are we lacking? What structural changes do we need to make? What strategies do we need to employ? Technology do we need to invest in? In that future state, you have choices, right? So the scenario planning under that one becomes, do I chase the trends, all right? Or do I create the future for our brand? And it really depends on where you're at and what availabilities and resources you have to pursue that. But if you wait for the change to happen, you could find yourself, like many retailers have found themselves with technology, very far behind and struggling to catch up. Now, you would think that most of us have learned that lesson, but you would be surprised. There are CEOs out there that don't want to tell the bartender anything, and meaning the board. And the boards sometimes fall into some strange, happy places. That they just listen to the financials, they hear the marketing strategy, they ask the questions relative to, how are the staff, how are we operating the front lines, is the merchandise available? Do we have any supply chain issues? Those are the kind of questions that randomly come out, and they're normal. But no one's been through this before. So they're not asking the tougher question is, so what's the state of the future? What's it going to look like? And how prepared can we be for that future? So, if you answer your question in that long form, you have three challenges: current state of the crisis, future state. Those are three things that board should be looking at, and the CEO needs to be answering.
So, oh my gosh, there's so much here. Offline, George, you were pointing out to us, I guess, I don't know if it's a novel concept or a resurgence of an old concept, but the idea of risk management being paramount. I mean, maybe you start with risk identification and then risk management, mitigation strategies. And I think maybe if there's a learning from the COVID pandemic, it's bringing that back, not just the opportunity, but the what ifs.
Mhm.
Um, you brought that up. Can you maybe you could elaborate that on a little bit, and also, how common has that been? Is this going to be a major shift in board governance, or is this kind of business as usual?
So it is, I mean, risk management is fairly common, right? It depends how thorough you are
Yeah,
and how it's managed. And if you're doing it yourself, there's always a tendency to say, "Nah, that'll never happen." The power grid will never go off. For a month. But again, it did happen. What, it's 2004, whatever it was. It has certainly impacted businesses back then. No, there won't be a flood, but yes, there is a flood, right? So it's always identifying those outliers that potentially can happen. Does anybody identify that something as severe as a pandemic could happen? I don't think so, not to my knowledge, anyway. But so risk management also entails, going out there. I'm going to use that Star Trek statement, to boldly go where no one else has gone before with your thinking, because that is really what it's about. It's a negative path towards risks. What could be the craziest thing that could happen, and are we prepared to handle it? And in the past, no one would have dared put something like that on the table, right? Very few organizations would have. But now, that we know that, this is an event that happens every 100 years or so, at least as far as we know. This is now on the table, and it will be. And companies will start looking at this and saying, so what mitigations should we do? We talked about the theater chain that has, writing in their contracts a force majeure that spared them from having to pay rent for 4 to 6 months. That's, those are the kinds of things that you have to incorporate and build in, but that's how you mitigate them. But unless you have an open dialogue and make everybody comfortable that you're ready to expose yourself to things that you never thought of before, the risk management is just going to stay down and dirty to the practical things that you're comfortable with.
So
The interesting thing on pandemics, we've had some really narrow escapes here in North America and Europe, because we've had 5 almost pandemics. If we include COVID, we had, I was trying to remember the fifth one, but we've had Ebola, H1N1, SARS, COVID-19 now, and there was another one I can't remember, but it's only over 20 years. So it's not like we had Spanish flu and we were perfectly fine for 100 years, and all of a sudden it came up and it was a completely black swan moment. I think that we were seriously underprepared for a pandemic because we had this very narrow view as to what the scope of the business is and what should be our main focus of interest, which was normally lowering cost, even if it was suboptimal. So I wonder what other factors are out there in the environment that we're seeing pictures of, glimpses of what could happen to us, and they should be definitely on risk management, risk register, I guess we technically call it, to actually say, yes, we're recognizing these risks. Now then we have to work through the process of, what's involved, what does it mean, what impact would that have on us? So I think the pandemic, for people claiming we have no knowledge that this might happen, COVID-19 was the 5th episode in 20 years. And if we just go back into I think it was 68, we had, is it a version of Hong Kong or Asian flu or whatever. So we've had these pictures that appeared, but we chose to ignore them because it was convenient.
So, moving forward into the future, right? Everybody needs to be thinking about the future state right now. I mean, you understand your current situation. That won't be hard to figure out. That's probably a half-hour conversation, at best. And then, the state of the crisis that we're in, again, maybe an hour, because you have to let people vent, because there's a lot of frustration around it. but it's the future state that you need to think about. And it's, the next, I'm comfortable in saying, I have my conviction is strong that 2021 is a year of vaccines, and 2022 is a year where we're going to trial everything again. We're going to be out there, but it probably won't be without masks, or risks. But beyond that, the future is, how is it going to unfold? How has these last 2-3 years changed retailing? Right, everybody's buying on e-commerce, right? I just had three packages delivered here, none of them for me. Just one other person in the house that picked them up. But at the end of the day, that's reality. And so how does retail rebound, and what does that look like? So what's the future state? How do stores change?
Can so for whatever, I don't know quite how we bumped into this years ago, but we've had a interesting kind of set of experiences where we've sort of co-created or just helped design AGMs for some clients, different clients over time. And the two things that kind of come to mind from what you're saying, George, one is their ability to think outside of their walls. Like, all of them do as best they can, digging into their ongoing existing metrics and doing a financial recap. It's not rocket science, right? And what's interesting in that is maybe there's new metrics that need to evolve. Like, I don't know how you do any kind of comparatives from 2020 to past years, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
No.
So the ability, I think, of the CFO and the exec team to be able to parse numbers in a way that makes sense, rather than just struggling with doing a comp, I think is going to be interesting. But the other one to me that always comes up is there's more comfort talking about the future state than talking about timelines. And I think the ability to put a goal or a target or any kind of discussion around the future, and then be able to talk about, are we talking about 1 year out, 5 years out, even 10 years out? That's where I see in our experiences, that's been a real struggle. And I think it's going to be necessary to get better at that, both the broader external view outside of your own numbers. And like I said, we've had some Mountain Equipment Co-op under Peter Robinson's on my mind these days. He was the CEO prior to David Labister. So this is going back to 06 to maybe 2010 or so, or 2011. He designed something really pretty cool, which was with a 3+ year window, there'd be a rotating series of major studies. So on, like, year one would be a thorough external review, call it PEST and SWOT and the whole thing, but actually having outside think tank type people in to look at that, everything about the world around them, and then drawing the implications back to Mac. And then the next year would be a competitive landscape review, and the third year would be a customer review, and it would just rotate like that. And it really forced them out of their operational moments. And then other clients who I won't name would be almost like, I'm going to say, a undergrad level PEST kind of approach. That's almost, and it goes up on the wall during the meetings, but no one even refers to it. And so I wonder if there's some rigor that's going to, now I'm not saying some of these are not, they're AGMs of organizations that aren't always direct equity plays directed by professionally run boards. So I want to make that clear. Anyway, I'll just throw that out there, and I'm sure Christine's got some views from Nike. The rigor of external review from Nike is probably massive, given its size.
But David,
I mean, I think the scenario plan piece is the critical piece, and it's not always the fun part of doing your job, because you really got to dig into every possible aspect. And in sort of leading off with you and George are saying, it's something that has to be done. I do believe in longer term strategic planning. I think a lot of businesses don't look at that. I think they sort of live in the here and now or in the past, and they're always looking to the past, which I think is equally important. But I think what's really important is starting to put stakes in the sand around, future state targets. Doesn't mean that that target can't move, but the board I'm on, we have a 100-year plan. Now that might sound crazy to some people, but we're looking out and sort of saying what things could affect us 100 years out. In some of the organizations that I work with, Nike and Adidas, they definitely do innovation plans. They look future state constantly. What's coming? What might affect us? And they're also looking outside of their industries. And I think that's an important point. Is as much as there are other retailers doing other things, like what innovations or things are happening outside of the industry that could inform or bring a new point of view or strategy to the retail landscape. And I think we're seeing different things happening across multiple areas of business, whether it's grocery or restaurants or flight, etc. So I do think that it's tough because you can't anticipate what's coming next. So I like the idea of the rolling consistent checkpoints, and I come from a world where consumer is king and consumer is the focus. And so really knowing your consumer and how's your consumer reacting to what's going on? Is there a trust level with your brand, with your consumer? Do you have a dialogue with your consumer, and do they know what you're doing, and are they buying into the work that you're doing, or how you're changing and evolving? So I do think you've got to take your consumer on the journey, but equally you've got to have the culture and the organization able to look forward, be open to scenario planning. And I think George talked about this a little earlier, just it's not always the fun, exciting stuff. And there can be a lot of negativity around it as you sort of think about all the worst case scenarios. But I think the pandemics prove that this is a worst case scenario that none of us would have anticipated. And so how do we kind of bring ourselves back out of that and look to the future state? And once we're through the next year of vaccinations, what's that world going to look like? And I agree with George, it's not going to be we throw off the masks and go crazy, but there will be a change in our culture that will evolve us forward, that may never be exactly what we were before pandemic, but might be really a great place to be post pandemic. So I'm an optimist in that sense, and hope that that we can move forward and that we'll start to see some positive improvement. But it's not without a lot of deep, hardcore work that's going to have to happen.
Yeah.
I'd like to just plus on your timeline thing really quickly with an illustrative example. And I guess MEC is on my mind these days because, or today, because we're talking about boards, and given what happened last fall, which I won't shy away from saying, I think a lot of what happened to MEC was a board fail. And we can either talk about that or not. But the prior CEO has taken some heat, David Labister. I actually think he really is a long-run thinker and saw a lot of things coming. Like the execution may not have worked. There's a lot of stuff that went on there. But I remember him at a conference on sustainability back in about 2011 and talking about helping with irrigation projects in Nepal. And I'll never forget this because it's bang on. If you have a business window in your mind of maybe 1 to 3 years, then MEC putting money into Nepal irrigation projects is a corporate social responsibility play. It's a charitable endeavor, a feel-good thing. But if you now start looking 10 to 20 years out, that's a major source of product for them. So if drought ravages Nepal, now they've got a supply chain issue. So when you change your horizon and think like that, David said, now we're talking about a business issue. So putting money into irrigation in Nepal in that framing is now a business investment, not a feel-good investment. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good illustrative example. And being comfortable with what timeline you're in can actually drive some really good dialogue, as opposed to having to be right about it, or like, is it 10 years or 15? It doesn't matter. But to your point, Christine, being able to go stretch out, I think, is really imperative.
I mentioned earlier that I didn't know of any organization that actually had thought about the pandemic, and that was a mistake. Stratford Festival in Stratford, the theater there, had actually had, now I don't know if it was on their strategy list or not, but they actually had pandemic as a risk, and it was covered by their insurance. So all the employees there actually got paid, and it said pay continuance. So it's very interesting that, I'm not sure it was foresight or it was, the good insurance company that was looking after their best interests, but certainly it happened. But at the end of the day, though, so we don't run out of time. I believe that right now boards are going to be thinking about, all right, if we need to make it out of this, and then we need to think about the future and where's the industry heading? How are we going? Can we play in the future? And do we have the right leadership at all levels that can actually create the kind of vision of the future for us and tell us and help us get there? That's the tough call that the board has to make. But the board's number one role is in having the right leader to run the organization. The number two role is to oversee strategy. Number three role is to make sure they're managing risks to strategy. And unfortunately, sometimes that's leadership. So all of it ties together. And that is what should be happening today. And if there are companies out there that are independent, and they're mid-sized companies that are run by an individual, well, they can always call the business of retail team to help them out and make that happen. We're up for that game because we have a lot of experience around the table to help anyone. But at the end of the day, right now, it's a business crisis within a health crisis. And you need retailers, other businesses are going to need a lot of help to get out of this one. There's no other way.
I'm wondering Gary's perspective, because Gary, we've talked about how you've often been brought in on a supply chain side, but really in turnaround type situations. And although this is across many organizations, on an individual basis, it's probably not that different to some of the things you've gone through. So, what have you experienced that might be applicable here from a strategy, very senior strategy meets board perspective?
The overwhelming finding when I have been brought in has been the people who have been leading this organization, not necessarily the board. Sometimes it's the investor, or sometimes it's the actual senior management team that say something's going wrong. We don't know enough about it. We need to bring somebody in to help. And their first view may be that, they're going to write a report. But it's pretty obvious to me when I as soon as I've arrived on site that there's some big howling issues. And when I sort of think about the question you're posing is, this conversation is very calm, but if we imagine ourselves right in the thick of what's been going on over the last 9 months, maybe a previous 2 or 3 years of pretty inadequate trading, and now we've almost running out of cash. Where does the board or the leadership team actually turn to actually inject that level of thinking, that level of bold management skill and technical competency into this situation? And is it in their interest to do that? Of course, logically it may be, but at what point do they get to the point when they're completely exhausted with their own options? They have to bring somebody like me back in the UK in to actually help them to move forward. And that's maybe a 3 to 6 month commitment of really hard work for the whole team. But often the team actually sits to one side because they know that when somebody like me's walked onto the site, that it's exposing that they haven't been able to manage. And the reason why I've been brought in is because that they've landed in a place where they can't think this problem through, or they're too operationally orientated, or they're too strategic. Maybe sometimes they just think that somehow if they talk about the big picture, it's going to correct itself. There's normally a missing link between the vision, the strategy, and the execution. It's all kind of pretty apparent it's broken. So my question here, as I was listening to the three of you, was that I wonder what is the trigger for them, for the board, for the leadership team to actually understand they really need some external help. And it isn't just, just getting a consultant in to write a report and do something over there and we know a little bit more about our business. But more importantly, when do they bring in that person, that short-term resource to actually jumpstart, kickstart, call it what you like, to actually kickstart their thinking process and actually do some execution on the ground, which is in the right direction to get them moving towards a particular goal.
Can I just address one thing you alluded to, which is very real, which is in a normal turnaround, there's a lot of explicit or implicit blame, right? I think the one good news piece about a pandemic is you can go through this change without feeling the blame. Like there's sort of a cover that's provided for everyone right now, that we're all going through this unforeseen moment. Even if there's a lot of things that got missed on the inside, there doesn't necessarily have to be the finger pointing. And maybe that's a good news piece in terms of the transformation that, needs to happen.
But I think to that point, David, I think that's a really positive way of looking at it. And I think it's helpful. However, since the lockdown, since the incident happened, it's what's happened in the last 9 months. And has the team responded well or not well? And as we look in, say, here for the next, for 2021 and looking into 2022, are things that weren't done during this very adverse, very uncertain period not talked about, not done, because there's actually a competency issue, that there is a perception issue of what this real problem is, because we've got the pandemic, but we've actually got our business to run. And some of those businesses have been locked down, but there's still plenty to do. Some of them being kept open, like the groceries, the essential retailers. And there's things to do which are different to when we're all working in steady state, doing 2% per year kind of thing. So there's still some, for another way, finger pointing to be done to say this area of the business, this function just wasn't fitting into where we were trying to get. And it does sort of roll into this whole question about culture, because I think we had a culture running into the pandemic, and then in silos, because they suddenly had a subordinate, superordinate goal to, we need to, say for retailers, fill that shelves up or whatever it might be. And they all individualized that culture within their silos. Nobody, I would argue, and I'm sure there's lots of exceptions, but nobody from maybe HR or the senior management team would say, we need to redevelop our culture to be able to do things for this intermediate period, or for maybe if we even have a vision about where we're going to be. What do we have to do in the culture to make that happen? So we don't reinforce the silos, because I think that we're through the pandemic, we may find the silos are things we need to chuck out. We need to get beyond silos to have organizations that perform well in the future.
George, like on that point, to what degree do you think boards need to behave differently vis-a-vis their executive, and B, will behave differently vis-a-vis the executive? And we could start with, hey, how often do they put culture on their Q&A list? But generally through the pandemic, what do you think is going to change from a board governance perspective, or should change?
So, well, first of all, to Gary's comments, the first thing that came to mind is chaos, right? Because it's business unusual, right? So you're struggling just to get through every day, whether it's e-commerce or through a store, through your physical stores. So that's one, and I believe the board will realize, okay, what mistakes did we make, and can we be focused on making sure that we can resolve these issues, so that this organization can continue to compete, because we don't know how long this will last, and what do we need to get there. So that's one. But they're going to be focused on the culture, and really the dynamically how I think they're going to be a little more tolerant of the CEO at this point, because there's no, as you said, there's no blame. But if that CEO has made decisions over the last 3 to 5 years that we don't need to invest in technology, or more so very slow in getting there, that would probably be on the minds of the board, that once we get out of one hurdle, we have to address the hurdle of leadership and whether or not they can get us, how fast they can get us to the next place. Those are going to be important decisions right up at the front. And then they're going to be looking, with the same leader or a new leader, they're going to be asking questions about culture and what is their vision and mission with the organization. That a lot of that may have to be revisited, because this is not a kind of crisis that only lasted a few days, right? We're marching up to a year, and so that changes how we do business, and you need to make sure that you're going to be able to compete. Can you imagine if this had happened at JCPenney when Ron Johnson was the CEO, marching away, heading towards becoming more e-commerce driven? It probably would have worked. It would have worked because of the circumstances that you were in, but it backfired because the consumer was not buying it. So it's always a question of timing and being right about all of this. So you have to, there's guesswork here at this point, and I think that may hold the board back from making the right decision too.
Do you think there's an opportunity then for executive CEOs to make bold pitches to the board that may have been rejected in the past, that now there's kind of like hey, we don't know what to do, so yeah, maybe we need to roll the dice?
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. That's what should be happening.
A lot of our experience, or my experience, has been with pretty iconic chains, but they tend to be privately held family businesses. And I've just always felt like there should be far more advisory boards put in place, even if they're not, official fiduciary governance boards. And a lot haven't done it, but I would think that's another thing I'd like to see happen from here on out, is if you're privately held, get advisors together and put in a board structure, even if it's not something that you're going to be fired over. You're still the family business.
Yep.
Now's the time.
I agree. I feel like this is a great opportunity as well, back to just the scenario planning. And we've got another year of hunkering down, and this is the perfect time for people to really go deep and assess their businesses on all levels. To George's point, like you can't necessarily hold people completely accountable, but at the same time, like if you're not poised for success moving forward, now's the point in time to make decisions and make change and affect change, to set yourself up for a future state that is going to be quite different than where we've been. So it goes kind of back to the scenario planning. I really like your idea, David, too, about the advisory board. I think that's a really important thing, whether it's formalized or informalized. I think there's a lot of people in the industry that could really share and learn from each other, as opposed to sort of staying in their little silos. And we've seen that. We've seen brands really collaborate. And I think this is a moment of collaboration and, an opportunity for us to kind of move forward out of this with a better kind of cohesive opportunity. So.
When Nike went through the factory backlash, and that's years ago now, right? You were just a kid, Christine, so I wouldn't expect you to remember that. But I remember a guy named Dave Coben, who was the head of innovation for a while at Nike, saying that it was so disruptive, it was so damaging for a moment. And then what happened was it actually rejuvenated the brand and actually created a lot of internal change that was positive. And I kind of wonder if you would say Nike today is more attuned to its external world and how it adapts because of that. And I know I'm kind of putting a leading question in, but I wonder if there's a positive with this in terms of organizations becoming more adaptive and resilient because of that governance and being able to be accountable to a more outside lens.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was actually at Nike Canada when that happened. And it was devastating. But at the same time, what it brought to light was it wasn't only Nike that was involved, it was other companies in the similar space. And it wasn't necessarily something that everybody knew about. It was sort of under the radar. But what it did was actually Nike, as often Nike can do, they came to the forefront and said, we want to affect change across the entire industry. and started to work with government to create change, to create better working conditions, to create accountabilities, to put a code of conduct in place for those factories. And that, all that still exists today. And they turned kind of a really negative, challenging situation into a real positive. And it wasn't, definitely without a lot of hard work on the part of the entire organization. But it really brought to mind then for all of us, like what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and made the factories accountable. And in many cases, they elevated their game plan and their strategy to kind of adhere to that, so that I think it made them more desirable as a factory partner. So I think any of those times where you take something as a negative and try and reframe and rework it to more of a positive, especially if it can be a game changer across an industry. I'll go back to Allbirds and Audi again, doing their partnership and trying to create this closed loop shoe and more environmentally friendly footwear. And I think that collaboration is really exciting to see in a space where typically it's highly competitive. So that gives me a lot of positive hope that there's a lot of brands out there that are willing to be collaborative and work for the common better of society, which I think is so great.
I kind of wonder if, if we think of pre-COVID, there's probably strategic pillars or themes that boards are either hearing or expect to hear from their exec. I wonder if this is just an acceleration of those sped up, like digital transformation, as one example, or like Gary's point about culture, like maybe culture going forward will rise in prominence around what boards are expecting to hear about, or maybe supply chain. I know, do you guys have any thoughts on that? What's going to be different in terms of big strategic imperatives? Is it just what was happening before but sped up, or is there something going to be different in terms of ranking or priority?
I'm just gonna be upfront and just say I think business survival is going to be the number one thing right now, and my worry would be is coming out of this. I think I still believe that we're in a state of execution for a lot of businesses, and once we get past that hurdle, then David, you'll see everything start going back to some of the core competencies like culture. And getting a better understanding of what kind of culture you need to have to get to the next place. But until that hurdle is, until we get to that business hurdle, through that business hurdle, I think the challenge is there.
Are you sort of saying that there'll be a hold on longer term thinking until the end of this year? In many cases, is that what I'm interpreting from what
you're hearing me say that there may, for some of these businesses who are in trouble, we're in trouble coming in, there's probably a hold on long-term thinking because they need to make sure they can get out of it. There's a state of execution at this point.
So the implication of that is for those that are kind of in a better position, they may accelerate ahead, like the gap between have and have not, which we've seen before on this podcast, is doubling down on that. That's going to widen.
Yep.
Okay.
Great conversation, guys. A lot to unpack. This is the Business of Retail podcast. David Ian Gray, George Minakakis, Gary Newbury, and myself, Christine Cowan. Thanks for watching.
You have been listening to the Business of Retail podcast, an unflinching strategic alternative to the conventional industry discourse. Thank you for joining us. For more information, please go to www.thebusinessofretail.ca.